This is Karen Engle here, and I'm just going to introduce you very, very quickly because we really appreciate that you're giving us this time. So, welcome everyone to Human Rights Dialogue, Xenophobia, and Migration in the Southwest Border Region. It's my great honor to have Congressman Greg Casar join us briefly to open this session. We're extraordinarily grateful to you for fitting us into what we know is a very, very busy schedule. And as I just said, to maximize his time, I will make the introduction very short. Congressman Casar represents Texas' 35th Congressional District and is also whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He has long been an advocate for the human rights of migrants through labor organizing work that he did in Texas and his 7 years on the Austin City Council that many of you know about already. In Congress, which he joined in 2023, he has expressed support for a full overhaul of what he calls our inhumane immigration system. And he's working on a number of efforts in Congress to fight xenophobia and its many effects. And we thought it only fitting that we open up this session with remarks by him. So thank you again, Congressman.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I so appreciate you all fitting me in as well amongst all of these experts and all of the work that you're doing. This is such an important topic, if not probably the central topic of American politics right now. I wish I could be there with you in person, but as you know, things are so busy during election season, and this has become such a heated issue within our elections. But being the university and wanting to step out of election mode, really in my first couple of years in Congress, the way that xenophobia has so warped our politics and been taken advantage of in our politics is just central to what's happening in Washington, D.C., to what's happening and running so much of the policymaking debates throughout Europe. And I just want to be here really to validate that this is exactly what we should be talking about if we're talking about human rights, if we're talking about progress, if we're talking about what's happening across the world in our own country. We have to be tackling the question of migration and not only how immigrants are treated in the immigration system, but really how we think of immigration, period, as a human rights issue, because it's being so deeply weaponized right now. As we know, it's a common playbook sort of throughout history for there to be some xenophobia that exists, for there to be politicians that take advantage of that sentiment to build their power, and then who expand that sentiment as much as they can in furtherance of really short-term political aims. And I think we're in a moment where we see that every single day. There's direct harm that kind of xenophobia causes, direct abuses, some of the worst kinds, like we saw at the shooting at the Walmart in El Paso, or what people in Springfield, Illinois are experiencing right now because of the lies being amplified about our Haitian brothers and sisters that have immigrated to the United States, fleeing disaster and desperation there. So, of course, there's the short-term intense problems and challenges that immigrants or people or folks that people think are immigrants can face, that violence that they can face because of spreading xenophobia. But what some of the most widespread harm is just done to us being able to actually tackle the real challenges that people face, because then people are distracted by the xenophobic lies rather than tackling the real issues. And so why I wanted to be here for a minute today is because I think really in this situation, the truth is really what sets us free. Because my experience as a city council member and as a member of Congress and as an organizer, and here in this last month, I've been actually outside of Texas to all parts of the country talking about this topic, that people from across the political spectrum, I think, really do believe still in overwhelming numbers in having an inclusive country, one that allows people to migrate here in a safe and orderly and legal way, one where everybody's human rights are respected, one where we actually are better off with more of us, with a more set of varied backgrounds and experiences, that immigration is actually good for this country and that immigrants are good, I think still prevails amongst people in our country well over xenophobia. It's just that xenophobia is so stoked up and is so loudly communicated that a lot of times the truth isn't able to shine through. And that when the truth shines through, people are caring and want to root out human rights abuses. They want people to be able to be safe as they immigrate. They want people to be able to be safe in this country. But it just takes us really making sure that we tackle and explain to folks and connect with people about what's really going on. There are even members of Congress that I've spoken with that don't fully understand, for example, what it is that has happened to Haiti over the course of its history ever since it emancipated itself, how the United States has played a negative role in that, and how that has contributed to the mass displacement of people from Haiti. The vast majority of people in this country and in our community, including members of Congress, haven't always well understood how the United States' own policies have contributed to some of the worst economic disasters that we've ever seen in the Western Hemisphere, including in Venezuela, and how we have so few legal options for people to migrate here that our own policies make it so that it's easy fodder for politicians that want to take advantage of the situation to call people illegal when, frankly, folks are just humans just trying to make their way through. And so by highlighting human rights abuses, but then also highlighting how our own systems and how our own choices put people in these situations in the first place, I think is so important. Because once everyday folks understand that folks immigrating here are in virtually every single case, just like you and me and just like anybody else on this call or in this room, facing really difficult situations. That's when I think empathy and inclusivity end up winning the day. And so you all really highlighting those issues, helping folks understand those issues is just so important. And I want to inject this conversation with some amount of that hope that we can at some point here really break through. I also want to be realistic that, as I mentioned, that in some ways the conversation nationally on this has gotten worse over the last few years. So I think there's hope that we can get to a place where inclusivity and empathy rule the day. But I think we also want to apply some urgency to this conversation, because I do think that in many ways we're moving backwards. But what I think is important for folks to know and to hear is that so many of the arguments against immigration as a human right and treating immigrants with full rights and with full dignity, that those arguments start to fall away when we provide solutions and alternatives to the system as we have it today. So often people have criticized humane immigration policies as somehow being a gift to cartels, when in fact having really few legal and orderly pathways for migration actually are what oftentimes lead to those human rights abuses, by pushing people to have to pay criminal organizations to migrate or wind up in cruel and detention facilities, either in Latin America or here within our own country. And so actually providing people solutions rather than retreating, I think is so very important. When folks say that we're creating a drag or creating a pull factor to the United States by having a humane and orderly immigration system, I think we need to be able to point out that folks oftentimes are fleeing no matter what, and are going to wind up going through a much more dangerous system if we don't create a more humane system. And so a big part of the message that we're trying to get out there is that immigration actually really can be good and is good, but we have a responsibility and an ability to actually create the kind of immigration system that Americans can be proud of, and what the vast majority of America, I think, actually truly wants, if we can cut through the disinformation and the propaganda. So I'm so thankful to each and every one of you for the work that it is you're doing here. Thankful to the experts, and looking forward to seeing what comes out of this continued work. Thank you guys so much.
We can take it down?
Okay.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you. So thank you for allowing us to move things around a bit to be able to receive those remarks. I'm Denise Gilman. I co-direct the Immigration Clinic here at Texas Law, and I really do want to welcome everybody here. Some of you have been here all day. Others study here, but I want to welcome all of you, some from the community here to the University of Texas School of Law. We're delighted to welcome you to this human rights dialogue on xenophobia and migration in the Southwest border region. Now that we're all in the same room, I do want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, and I want to acknowledge the American Indian and indigenous communities who have been or become a part of the lands we call Texas, including the Alabama Cuchara, the Caddo, the Carrizo Comecrudo, the Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo. Tonight's event brings together two esteemed experts from the UN human rights treaty bodies, Pablo Ceriani from the UN Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers, and Ibrahima Guissé from the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we're also joined by two experts on immigration law and policy and practice with long careers in this world, Professor Becky Sharpless from the University of Miami and Claudia Muñoz from Organiza, Texas. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here tonight. Unfortunately, Shobha Sivaprasad Wadia with DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties was not able to join us, so we are not going to be able to have that DHS voice. The panel is following an all-day thematic consultation on a joint general guidance document that the two UN committees are developing to articulate obligations under international human rights law for the purpose of combating and eliminating xenophobia and racism against migrants. These guidelines would apply to all states that have ratified either of the conventions, and so fortunately that includes the U.S., which has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but has ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So these would be authoritative guidance to the United States. It's a really timely conversation, as Representative Casar mentioned, and as we all know in this room, we really have seen a frightening trend of hatred and xenophobia directed at migrants and even those who are perceived as such or treated as such. We hope the evening's conversation, evening's conversation, will allow us to think globally about the rhetoric and policies and practices that shape the treatment of migrants, especially in the U.S. Mexico border region. Thinking about the extent to which dehumanization and criminalization of those labeled as others worsens. We feel that it's more important than ever to engage in open and informed dialogues that emphasize human rights and human dignity of all people. I need to thank and want to thank a number of collaborators who helped to make this public event happen, including the Rapoport Center for Human Rights and Justice, which Karen Engle heads, the Sissy Farenthold Fund for Peace and Social Justice, Texas Global, the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis, the Latin American Initiative at Texas Law, Latino Studies, the William Wayne Justice Center for Public Interest Law, the Center for Asian American Studies, the John Warfield Center for African and African Diaspora Studies, and the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies. Really a tremendous showing of support from across this campus, from a whole range of institutions, and we are incredibly, incredibly grateful for that ability to bring experts together all day today and for this panel this evening. I especially need to thank, again, Cooper, Christensen, and Alyssa Steglitz for working with me, and Karen Engle, who's here tonight, but also has been just incredible in helping to pull this all together, organizing this public panel and the entire day's events. And I also especially want to thank Caroline Hahn and a number of committed students whose work behind the scenes has made all of this possible as well. So now I'm going to turn the microphone back to Karen Engle, who is the Minerva House Drysdale Regents Chair in Law and founder and co-director of the Rapoport Center, to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Denise. And I just echo the many thanks to those of you who have contributed to this event and also those who have been with us all day long. It's my real honor and pleasure to be here on this public panel. And I'm just going to briefly introduce the roundtable participants, and then we'll start to hear from them. So one of the things that we haven't really said about the committees is that they're not full-time jobs. So both Pablo Ceriani and Ibrahima Guissé have day jobs. So I thought I would say what they are. So Pablo Ceriani is professor of migration and human rights at the National University of Lanús in Argentina. And I will say, in addition to being a member of the UN Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families, he also serves as committee's vice chairperson, right? And have off and on. You're currently the vice chair. Pablo is the author and editor of numerous publications on migration policies and human rights, and over the last 2 decades, he served as a consultant on initiatives related to migration, policies, and human rights for numerous international organizations, including UNICEF, the ILO, and the IOM. Dr. Ibrahima Guissé is associate researcher at the Institute of Sociological Research of the University of Geneva, where he researches and teaches on migration and human rights, systemic racism, diversity and inclusion, and sustainable development. And he's been able to bring that important perspective to his work at the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Ibrahima is the author of a series of publications addressing issues of migration, systemic racism, and the blind spots, as he puts it, of public policies. He's also the founder of the African Assembly for the Defense of Human Rights in Geneva, which has a French name that I will not attempt, and similarly, the co-founder of the Center for Research and Action for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, based in Dakar, Senegal. Claudia Muñoz Castellano, just to my left here, is a community organizer, strategist, and founding member of Organiza, Texas. She's also, I can announce publicly, a recent recipient of a Soros Justice Fellowship to establish legal empowerment networks for immigration in Texas for those impacted by Operation Lone Star, which she'll tell us about as we start talking in a moment. She has organized successful collaborative campaigns across multiple issue areas of the immigrant justice movement, particularly at the intersections of labor and the criminal legal system. And she's also co-authored 2 books about immigration detention and serves on the board of directors of the Highlander Center and Just Futures Law. And last but not least, we're really happy to have Professor Becky Sharpless with us today, who is the founding director of the Immigration Clinic at the University of Miami, where she also teaches immigration law and researches the intersections of immigration, criminal law, and progressive lawyering. Her scholarship critiques the traditional immigration reform framework that contrasts model immigrants with those convicted of crimes, advocating for reforms informed by racial and class critiques of the U.S. criminal justice system. She has a recent book which received an Independent Publisher Book Award, which is entitled Shackled, 92 Refugees Imprisoned on ICE Air, from the University of California Press. And we'll hear a little bit more about that soon. So congratulations, too, on that award. So now we'll have some discussion, and we really do want this to be a roundtable, so we have some questions for each of you, but also there will be opportunities both for the audience to interact, but for you all to interact with each other. So we thought we'd start by talking about xenophobia. I mean, we're not starting. Congressman Casar got us well on our way, but we wanted to maybe ask a little bit about why and how you all began to use that word in the committees. So the word xenophobia doesn't appear in either the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination or the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. And yet, it's not a new term in the UN to identify what are often racialized attitudes, policies, and practices. So the UN's racial equality efforts have emphasized combating xenophobia since, I think, at least the early 1990s, including during the 2001 Durban World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Race-Related Intolerance, so you could hear it in the title. And I think, Ibrahima, you participated in the Durban meetings. And the Committee on Migrant Workers has emphasized combating xenophobia since its beginning, it seems, even though it's not in the convention. Although international human rights law hasn't produced a clear textual definition of xenophobia, it seems that the UN system has been thinking about it and attempting to eliminate it for some time. So we'd love to start by hearing from each of you about maybe why your committees decided to carry out this initiative independently and together, and why you framed it around xenophobia, although very much making it clear that you're doing that in an intersecting way. So it'd be great if you could each speak to issues or challenges maybe that you've witnessed around the world, both before the start of this process and since, that is involved in this endeavor for developing universal guidelines. And then I'll come back to you if you don't get to it. I'd love to hear whether you think any countries, I know there are countries that are doing a better job than the United States, but whether any are engaging in some practices or policies that you think might be worth following. So, do you start, Pablo?
Hello? Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for inviting us to be part of this conversation. We are very glad to be here. Well, maybe as basic information for beginning, this convention on the rights of migrant workers and their family was adopted in 1990 by all the states which are members of the UN. It was like unanimously adopted in December 1990, but unfortunately, since then, only 59 states out of almost 200 states members of the UN did ratify this convention. No? So they voluntarily obliged to implement this convention and internally, no, and including in the legislation. And most of those countries are from the global south. But in any case, despite of that, in our work, we address all the human rights issues in the entire migration context. That includes countries of origin, countries of transit, and countries of destination. So many times we end up addressing, for instance, situation in the US or in European countries that haven't ratified our convention yet, but then migrants from countries that did ratify the convention that are living there or trying to enter those countries. So in a way, we end up assessing the situation of migrants in almost all parts of the world. So through that job, what we have increasingly witnessing in the last decade, at least 2 decades, but it's increasingly every single year, is how xenophobia in a broader sense, when we think about xenophobia, and we are trying to reflect that, even though that we are still discussing terminological aspect, xenophobia is as a sort of umbrella and that is directly or indirectly linked to a wide set of policies, attitudes, measures, narrative that are behind the main challenges in terms of human rights protection in the context of migration nowadays. So xenophobia is not only narrative that are accusing migrants of being criminal or being the cause of all our problems, not targeting migrants and trying to push for some kind of hate or xenophobic violence or racism violence and so on, but also many other grades of speeches and narrative that are misinforming policies, that are pushing for unequal treatment, pushing for discrimination, no? Trying to legitimize that having been born in another country but living in a country of destination is not enough for exercising the same rights that we all have as human beings. So increasingly in our committee, every time that we review the situation in a particular country, we see how, I mean, not in every country, but in many countries, how policies are being shaped by this kind of narrative, no? That presenting migrants not as full members of the community where they live, where they work, where they have families, and as any other human being, but others, no? But underserving people or less deserving people. And so it's not just about hate, but this kind of the building of a narrative that are trying to shape or unequal societies, and this kind of inequality treatment is, and that's something that we see on a daily basis, is structurally linked to racism. No, I mean, it has, of course, historical grounds, no, linked to colonialism, linked to slavery, and to many other structural factors that, for the last even centuries, have been unfortunately shaping this asymmetrical world, these unequal societies, where not only nationality, by the skin color, ethnicity, gender, among other factors, have been, I mean, behind the different layers of inequality that describe our society. So we understand xenophobia with this lens, this broader lens, and that's why we came to this idea jointly with the third committee to address this issue in the same holistic way that we see how these narratives, how this broader sense of xenophobia is a cross-cutting issue. No, it's affecting every single aspect where human rights are at stake. I mean, of course, there are some contexts, such as border contexts, where these narratives are very powerful, no? and affecting migrants in a very, very sensitive way. I mean, even leading to policies that lead to the increasing number of people that die, that disappear in migratory routes, but also to other kind of discriminatory policies, no? Access to social rights, access to healthcare, access to asylum, no? Very basic commitments that states have been at least formally reinforcing since 1948, since the end of the World War II and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But nevertheless, what we see, no, is how human rights of migrants are being increasingly affected, increasingly violated, and this is totally linked with this narrative. So, as it's a holistic problem, we need a holistic solution. So it's not just how to do better in terms of preventing hate speech and how to address the responsibility of different actors, from governments, from media, from other stakeholders that are pushing for this kind of hate speech, and how to make them accountable on that attitudes, but also how to address this kind of other consequences, no, discrimination in access to all the catalog of human rights. So that's why we decided to work together to develop this kind of holistic guidelines, which is part of our mandate. No, the states gave us this mandate to develop guidelines, and they should follow these guidelines. And we are doing this together not only because our mandates, complement each other, but also because we are aware that, unfortunately, as I said at the beginning, many countries of the world haven't ratified our convention. So through this collaborative work, in a way, we are also addressing the situation in many countries, including the U.S., including Canada, and all the members of the EU, the European Union, that are not part of the convention. No, we are working together also in order to bring them these guidelines that hopefully may end up in policy change, no? in addressing border in a holistic way, as the congressman said, in taking into account the pressing need that many people have nowadays for fleeing their country and to do it in an orderly way, to do it in a protected way, no? And to access to asylum, to access to other kind of protection, no, and many other issues that we want to address. I don't know if I have 1 more minute just to share good practice. Okay, so only one. Fortunately, we evidence good practice. There are many countries of the world that don't detain migrants, for instance. Period. Irregular status is not a crime. It's just an administrative issue. And they never build up any detention center, for instance. No? And they create pathways to access to a regular status, to forbid any discrimination in access to healthcare or education due to migration status. So there are a lot of good practices in different countries, even countries that are coping with many challenges in terms of human mobility, many people coming to the country. But just for choosing one example, I would name Colombia. Why Colombia? Colombia has been until very recently, and to some extent is still dealing with a lot of issues related to the armed conflict, internal force displacement, and also having the highest number, or one of the highest number of in terms of people leaving the country due to the armed conflict and persecution, etc., until nowadays. But nevertheless, in the last 5 years, 6 years or so, Colombia received about 3 million Venezuelans, and almost other 3 or 4 million cross Colombia to go to other countries. So it's transit country, destination country. In that context, they didn't create any detention center, any massive deportation policy, nothing like that. I mean, they been developing different tools for ensuring and facilitating those people to access to a regular status, a resident permit, a long-term resident permit, and more importantly, in the context of this conversation, of course, receiving 3 million people in a country that has structural issues in terms of poverty, in terms of violence, and in terms of discrimination, for instance, against indigenous people, and in terms of Colombian Afro-descendant, and so on. Even in such challenging contexts with much less capacities than many countries from the global north, they are trying. They are developing policies at local level, at national level, in order to prevent xenophobia, because integration and prevention of xenophobia is not just, it's not enough with a sort of magic word. I mean, we need an active state, no, to develop policies at different levels, at different sectors. So they are trying, and they are getting outcomes. Of course, there are many challenges, but they would have been much more challenged if they had tried to close the border, if they had required a visa, if they had created detention centers. No, the challenge in terms of security, organized crime behind the people mobility, and so on. I mean, would be there, but we are discussing how to do better. Well, they are discussing. I'm not from Colombia. I'm not based there, but I think this pretty good example, no matter how many challenges are remaining, and it will be there for a long time, but it's usually a long-term process we are discussing. Thank you.
Thank you. Ibrahima.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Karen, for giving me the floor. Allow me to shift in French, if possible. Ouais, je pense que je voudrais d'abord rappeler une chose pour revenir à la question de Karen.
First, answering Karen's question, I'd like to remind you of something.
Elle a posé une question sur la xénophobie qui n'a pas de définition légale.
She asked a question about xenophobia that doesn't have a legal definition.
Et j'ai l'impression que tous les fléaux du monde n'ont pas de définition légale.
I have the impression that all the
fléaux,
it's like the plague, all the plagues in the world do not have a legal definition.
Même la notion de racisme n'a pas de définition légale.
Even the notion of racism doesn't really have a legal definition.
Par contre, le CERD a une définition sur la discrimination raciale, c'est l'article 11 du CERD. Par contre, le CERD définit la discrimination raciale et non pas le racisme.
So the racial discrimination is defined, but not racism itself.
Donc, ça veut dire simplement que c'est peut-être là aussi donc l'intérêt de cette recommandation générale.
This also points to the interest of this
C'est la recommandation générale. C'est la recommandation générale. C'est ça l'intérêt de cette recommandation générale. C'est ça l'intérêt de la recommandation générale. This is the interest of this general recommendation.
Pardon. Sorry. This is the reason why it's important to do this legal recommendation.
Par exemple, je prends un exemple précis. De 2022 à 2024,
Let me take a precise example from 2022 to 2024.
au CERD, nous avons ce qu'on appelle l'alerte d'urgence précoce. L'alerte d'urgence précoce. Le mécanisme d'alerte d'urgence. Le mécanisme d'alerte d'urgence. Le mécanisme d'alerte. Early warning is an action procedure. We have a mechanism. Early warning is an action procedure. Depuis 2022, nous avons sorti des déclarations dans presque toutes les régions du monde.
Since 2022, we issued press releases in all corners of the world. Statements.
Sur la question, en Afrique subsaharienne, la mer Méditerranéenne, par exemple,
On the question of sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean Sea,
la mer Méditerranéenne qui est devenue une cimetière.
the Mediterranean that has become a cemetery.
Nous avons sorti aussi une déclaration même avec le conflit iranien, des gens qui fuyaient.
We have also issued a statement on people
Fleeing
from Iran,
from Ukraine.
from Ukraine.
From
sorry.
Ukraine. Nous avons aussi sorti une déclaration sur l'Amérique au niveau de Haïti.
We have also issued a statement regarding IT.
Donc, depuis 2022, ce que l'on remarque, c'est qu'il y a une croissance
So since 2022, there has been more and more
une attaque contre les personnes dites étrangères
attacks against people who are said to be strangers
ou perçues étrangères.
or who are believed to be strangers.
C'est là la complexité du problème. Dans la plupart des observations que nous avons avec les États partis,
In most of these observations, the statements that we've issued,
je dis bien tous les États,
and I specify that this is in all states,
nous sommes confrontés à cette question.
we are confronted with this issue,
Donc ça veut dire
which means that,
que quelque part, effectivement, il y avait un besoin.
that there was a need.
Et je dois dire aussi que les recommandations générales
Oh, and these general recommendations
visent effectivement à donner des orientations aux États.
seeks to give orientations to states.
Autrement dit, dans toutes les frontières du monde,
In other words, at all the borders of the
on
world,
observe des souffrances.
we see suffering.
Dans toutes les frontières du monde.
At all the borders of the world.
Aujourd'hui, donc, nous avons parlé de la question de la frontière du Mexico.
Today, we specifically spoke about the U.S. Mexican border,
Et dans le cadre des consultations que nous avons eues à Bangkok,
and in the framework of the consultations we had in Bangkok,
nous avons des situations avec les Rohingyas.
we have seen the situation of the Rohingya.
Autrement dit, dans toutes les régions du monde,
So, in other words, in all the regions of the
c'est
world,
effectivement là le fléau.
it's where the plague is.
Donc, comment faire pour susciter le débat?
How do we re-situate the debates?
En réunissant toutes les organisations internationales, des partenaires,
We try to unite all the international organizations, all the partners,
le monde académique,
the academic world,
la société civile,
the civil society,
pour voir effectivement comment réfléchir sur la question.
to see how we can speak about this issue.
Et je pense que c'est un défi majeur que nous avons lancé.
And I believe that it's a major endeavor that we've started.
J'ai parcouru la plupart des recommandations.
I've looked at most.
J'ai visité.
I've visited most of these occasions.
Je pense que celle-là, elle est l'une des premières à avoir réuni autant de consultations globales.
And I believe that this one is the first one to have united as many consultations that we see.
Parce qu'il s'agit de prendre les réalités locales,
Because we're trying to look at local
ce
realities,
qui se passe concrètement,
what really happens,
et essayer de
concretely,
restituer ça dans un document cohérent.
and try to
To put it, comprehensive.
to make it transpire into the document that we're writing.
Et de ce point de vue, nous sommes plus ou moins satisfaits de ce que nous avons entendu.
And we're more or less satisfied with the process.
Et maintenant, tout le défi, effectivement, pour nous,
And for us,
c'est comment donner la cohérence à cela.
and we feel that this document is coherent.
Comment ne pas trahir ce que nous avons vu et entendu.
How do you write this without betraying what we've heard?
Mais il faut aussi garder à l'esprit
We have to keep in mind
qu'une recommandation générale
that a general documentation
ne vise pas un état précis.
is not cannot take into account a precise local issue.
C'est à ce niveau qu'on situe le défi.
This is what's really challenging about writing this document.
Comment faire pour être à la fois général
How can we both be general, universal,
tout en étant précis?
and be really precise?
Voilà ce que je vais dire pour le moment.
This is what I wanted to say.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
That's a perfect segue. Because, yeah. Thank you both. Really, it is so important. It's a good segue because I'm going to try to do it anyway, even though you just said that's the challenge, is to be sort of both global and more specific and local. But at least for the purposes of this conversation, I think that's exactly what we want to try to do. So I'm going to try to bring it to Texas and specifically to Claudia. Claudia, you've been a leading voice and organizer for years now on immigration issues, and not just the most recent happenings in Texas, but detention, deportations at the national level too. But most recently, your focus has been on the targeting of immigrant communities by the state of Texas through Operation Lone Star and other state-level immigration legislation. So can you just maybe start by telling us a little bit more about what's happening in Texas with Operation Lone Star and SB4, and then to the extent you can get to this in the first round, what role is xenophobia playing in these measures, to your mind?
Absolutely. Thank you, Denise. I do want to start by acknowledging that these are really heavy things to talk about. I think especially for racialized people who are the target of this. I just want to invite us to take a collective deep breath and release it and just kind of let our bodies understand the fullness of what we are talking about. I think this morning we spent really incredible time talking about these issues and sort of the theory and all of the definitions, but I think we all know that they're very much happening in practice, and unfortunately Texas is a place where they're very much on display. I do want to say though, we talk a lot about Texas, and I love talking about Texas. However, in a country that's so deeply tied to xenophobia like the U.S., this is not the first time we have seen this type of laws, right? We saw this similar policy passed in California with Prop 187 in 94. We saw this in Arizona with SB 1070, the Show Me Your Paper laws. And this is sort of the escalation and the manifestation of what it looks like for a xenophobic country and state to implement policy around discrimination of migrants. So I also want to name that here in Texas, I think it's important to name who are the drivers and the authors of a lot of the policy, xenophobic policy that's happening. Here in Texas, we have Governor Greg Abbott, who has been in office actually since 2002. He was the Attorney General of the state of Texas before he was governor. One of the first things he did as governor of Texas in 2017 was that he implemented SB4, and you'll realize that Texas loves naming their anti-immigrant laws SB4, so I'll name that a few times. But in 2017, they passed the first one, which was a copycat of SB 1070 in Arizona. For context, the border security spending of Texas at that time in 2017 was $800 million with an M dollars. Currently, our border security spending is $11 billion. And so just in 7 years, it has increased from $800 million to $11 billion. One of the ways that Abbott figure out how to use xenophobic rhetoric to build, really grow, resource, and weaponize an already troubled criminal justice system to target migrants is through Operation Lone Star. So Operation Lone Star started really in 2021, and what he did is that he listened to people like Ken Cuccinelli, which a lot of you may know, but he worked for Trump's DHS from 2019 to 2021, and he's one of the co-authors of Project 2025. But he was one of the main people that sort of lobbied Abbott to enforce Operation Lone Star. Operation Lone Star is a quasi-military system to criminalize and prosecute migrants, most of them for criminal trespass. And so the way that looked like is that Abbott passed an emergency declaration alleging that Texas was under invasion for migrants, and he used that opportunity to create an enhanced misdemeanor and prosecute migrants. In that way, he emptied out 2 state prisons to hold migrants pre-trial, many without access to representation, to bail, and many other really horrible conditions. He sent law enforcement and the military to the border, and he lobbied other states as well. So at some point at the Texas border, we had law enforcement from Florida, from Iowa, from New Hampshire, and many other states. It is believed that, the numbers are questionable. I was just talking to Kristen about this, but it is believed that there are about 38,000 people that have been prosecuted, migrants, prosecuted under Operation Lone Star, and the cost per prosecution, it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. When you take 11 billion and take the 38,000, it's about we believe between $300,000 and $400,000 per prosecution. A lot of this money is going to resource the local sheriffs, counties, jails, judges, etc. As before, as Denise mentioned, it's probably what most of you have heard recently in the news. It is an escalation of Operation Lone Star. There have been many escalations, the busing of immigrants, and as before, is sort of like the latest manifestation of it. And really what it is a copy of federal statute 1325 and 1326 for illegal entry and reentry. I won't get into all of it. I am not an attorney. I am an organizer. But it's currently in the court, so we're still trying to figure out what's going to happen. A hearing has been set for after election. But the third, as before, really, has gone into effect in February. And that one enhanced the sentencing or the time for smuggling into a minimum of 10 years, which smuggling is the second charge that Operation Lone Star uses to enforce itself. I think just really quickly in connection to xenophobia and how it's driving all these policies, I do want to name 2 things. The really scary one is that we have a legislative session that starts in January of next year. Some of the legislative priorities that we know are coming up are the deputizing militias and vigilantes at the border. So there's a lot of very racist people who are wanting to arrest migrants themselves, and Texas is looking into actually deputizing them. Texas wants to establish a state-based Department of Homeland Security, so effectively taking that power away from the federal government. Prosecuting organizations, they're already doing this, but they want to actually codify into law, prosecuting organizations, individuals, churches who are helping migrants. They want to sort of blanket implement E-Verify. And one of the most troublesome, which kind of mirrors Prop 187, is to ban public services for migrants, particularly they want to get rid of in-state tuition for undocumented migrants, but also prohibit children of undocumented migrants from accessing public education. And the other thing that I think I should share with everybody is that sort of when Operation Lone Star started, the way that Greg Abbott was going around organizing ranchers, right, because they needed ranchers to give law enforcement access to private land to charge them with trespassing, is that they were just kind of organizing these rancher meetings at the border. And I've attended 3 out of 4. The first one was very much explaining Operation Lone Star, what it was, and that was like back in 2021. The last one that I attended was in a border county, Kinney County, in January, and that was one of the most horrible racist, xenophobic things I've attended. The ranchers that participated, along with law enforcement, were basically asking the elected officials in attendance, mostly county and border representatives, what they could do to shoot migrants and not be prosecuted. And the county attorney from Kinney, Brent Smith, basically told them, first thing you should do is get Second Amendment insurance. And the other thing you should know is that all you would have to do if you shoot a migrant and want to get away with it is that the only thing you have to do is convince 12 people here in Kinney County, a border county of like 2,000 people, that you acted in self-defense. And so that's kind of the conditions that we are living in, organizing in, and dealing with. They're really horrible. And so I will just close by saying that in a xenophobic system like the U.S., every single migrant death is a matter of public policy and practice.
Can we do that deep breath again? Yeah, thank you for sharing what some of the details that haven't been out there. Well, I won't say we're moving to a more uplifting story. So Becky, as I mentioned, you did publish earlier this year your book, Shackled, 92 Refugees Imprisoned on Nice Air, and did an incredible job of documenting what took place with a group of Somali refugees. And I'm not going to keep going because I think you obviously tell the story better than anyone else. So I'd love for you to tell us a bit about what happened to them, and including the two refugees you profile. And just to say, I think it's very impressive your book doesn't shy away from understanding the treatment of them as a form of racialized harm. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts also about how xenophobia continues to intersect with anti-Black racism to shape these experiences.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Denise, for the invitation to come and be part of this conversation. So the book is not an academic book. It is a narrative nonfiction book, which basically means it's a true story that I attempted, and you can, if you read it, tell me if I achieved this result, attempted to write like a novel. And essentially take you inside the experiences of 92 individuals from Somalia who were shackled at their wrists, from their wrists to their waist, and at their legs, on their ankles, for 2 days on a failed deportation flight that left from a private prison in Louisiana, landed in Senegal, where there was supposed to be some refueling, and the plane was supposed to then proceed on. It never did. It was stuck for an entire 24 hours on the tarmac. The men and women were not allowed to stand up. Bathrooms started to not work, and they were not allowed to use them after a certain point. And so they were immobilized in their seat for, in the end, a total of 2 days. The plane turned around and came back to Miami, where my legal clinic at the University of Miami got involved with a very large group of other lawyers and groups who intervened to try to help. There was also abuse that happened on the plane when the plane was stuck on the tarmac for 24 hours, including use of the wrap, which Fatma talked about earlier today, which is a straitjacket that the special ops people on the plane had just learned how to use, and used on people, including the smallest, most petite man on the plane. They used the wrap against people. So we filed a class action lawsuit. The government was just going to turn around and deport everyone without doing an investigation, despite the allegations, despite the press coverage. Newsweek broke a story about what had happened. They were just going to turn around and put people on a plane in a couple days. So we filed a class action to stop the plane, and then got everyone who wanted to fight their case a lawyer to try to reopen their deportation proceedings, which, if you know anything about immigration law, is really hard to do. I think before I represented people on that plane, I had probably won, less than 10 motions to reopen, frankly. But we got pro bono lawyers for every single person who wanted to try and stay. The story is told through the eyes of two of the men on the plane. One who came as a refugee from Somalia's civil war as a child, had a criminal record, was being deported for that criminal record, Saeed. And Abdullahi, who was an asylum seeker who had been detained at some of our worst detention centers for about 2 years before he was on the plane. I won't tell you how their individual stories sort of pan out, but it sort of follows them, tells their backstory, and then follows them through their individual cases, through detention, where there's pepper spray and use of isolation and other terrible things. So the book has an extended metaphor with slavery, The airplane is like a slave ship, and it's a reverse Middle Passage back to Africa. This was the way the men thought of what had happened to them. When we interviewed them, they used words that evoked our past as a nation enslaving people. The handcuffs that they were handcuffed in were actually made by a company that has existed for centuries and mass-produced handcuffs for use in slavery. So there's a through line. So there's a through line from slavery to what is happening on these massive privately contracted planes that are being sent back to Africa. And I guess on the one hand, it was an exceptional circumstance what had happened to the 92 men and women. On the other hand, it's an inevitable result. It was very foreseeable that this could happen because we've constructed a massive infrastructure of detention and deportation, a massive detention centers where asylum seekers are held, but also a pipeline from jails and prisons to immigration detention centers and then to deportation, such that it's foreseeable that this would have happened, right? We're shackling on a daily basis. We're shackling people who are in immigration detention anywhere they go. They're shackled to visit the doctor. They're shackled even for a short trip somewhere, and they're shackled every time they're deported. So it is inevitable that something like this would have happened, and it's a function of this massive system that we've constructed. And the last thing I'll say about the book is that it's also really pushing back on the good-bad narrative, the good immigrant, bad narrative, bad immigrant narrative, the contrast between so-called asylum seekers with people who are being deported because of commission of a crime. And I'm happy to talk about that more later, but I think that is one of the goals of the book, is to have the reader really identify with Said and Abdullahi in an equivalent way. And it's not an intellectual book. It's more of a story that is supposed to speak not only to your mind, but also your heart. And that was why I wrote it. And I had some time on my hands during COVID.
But can I just quickly follow up on that, and then I want to turn back. One of the things I thought was really helpful about the book is that it put a pretty strong finger on the ways in which both race and migration status intersected, maybe under the umbrella of xenophobia, however you want to connect them, but to both allow a narrative about who the men were, men and women were, who were being deported, and then to kind of justify the treatment of them. You want to say just a quick word about that, sort of what the kind of imagery was of who they were based on their race and migration status?
Yeah, so I guess the place to start is that we filed a lawsuit to get at the report that was issued when they investigated what had happened on the plane. At first, they denied that there was anything available, so we've had to file a lawsuit in district court to even get the report. And the conclusion was that nothing out of line had happened, that there was no problem here, which was I was flabbergasted. Even though it did acknowledge that there was abuse and the use of the rap, there were also other things that had happened on the plane. So it was acknowledging these things happened, but said that there was no problem. And it also was characterizing particularly the men on the plane, there were only 2 women, as angry and combative, black men, high risk, which is code for black African men, and also saying that Somalis were the, quote, worst Africans. So it was absolutely a racialized understanding of what was happening, and I could tell that, I mean, if you could think of, think about white Canadians on a tarmac for a day or two, there would have been some very high-level diplomatic intervention in that instance, and that just wasn't because it was all racialized. It was seen as normal and not a problem, and so that's, you know, the racism just was at every level. It's structural. It's with the individual ICE officers and how they interacted with the people on the plane. It's just from every little detail to the root causes and the structure.
And then the justification after. So the way it happened and then the justification. Yeah. Thank you for that. So turning back to Pablo and Ibrahima, maybe trying to move us a little bit more, not exactly towards optimism, but towards, you know, how can we make an effort to change, and specifically thinking about how state and local governments and national governments could bring their work more into line with international standards, and how you think the general recommendations, comments might help with that process. Can you help us think about, like, how can we try to move towards something that looks different, and how can we use the international standards you're developing to get there?
Well, let me first say that we must be optimistic. We are forced to be. I mean, we are in a privileged situation witnessing the tough daily life of millions of people that have to flee their country, are treated as if they were, I mean, a plague, no? I mean, so unfairly, no? So those of us who have the privilege to do this job, I mean, we cannot lose the optimism, no? I mean, we have to do our best. Migration is here and will be here. We are dealing with a multidimensional structural phenomenon on the world we live. Unless structural issues of asymmetries around the world, among regions, within countries are really addressed, we will take some time to be changed how unequally the global wealth is being distributed and the power is distributed and so on. We will be dealing with this reality for I don't know for how long. So this is the reality. And no any immigration law enforcement or whatever, even in the how race it is shaped, how xenophobically is shaped, will end up. What it will do is create more violence and harm on people that are forced to flee their country due to a number of factors, including violence and conflict, discrimination, and so on. So what to do with that? Because the reality will be here. I mean, so and the communities and the society are increasingly more diverse every single year through human mobility. But of course, many people are in a very irregular and very precarious conditions in the country where they live. So, one of the tools or the path that we think that are critical is, I mean, we are always talking about migration, but I personally believe that we have to demigratoricize the discussion, because it's not about migration. I mean, treating people fairly and ensuring equal rights and equal protection is not about migration. It's about, their discussion is in another way. I mean, it's in another part. I mean, it's discussing about human development and which kind of society we want to have in 10 or 20 years. So it's about the discussion about working conditions, it's about education, it's about protecting families, it's about, every single issue that we normally talk about, because it's about human beings that are members of the same community. So the discussion is there. That means that the discussion is not necessarily, thinking of the U.S. reality, the discussion is not about, or it's not with Homeland Security. It's with many other policymakers in different fields that have to, at local level, at state level, at federal level, have to implement policy for the whole community, no matter where they came from, or if they were born here or somewhere else. So these guidelines are towards mainly them. I mean, of course, there are many guidelines that will be directed to immigration enforcement authorities, because this machinery or this system of detention and deportation is wrong since the very beginning, because it's framed with this kind of narrow approach, structurally linked to racism and so on, and it has been legitimizing in some countries that has this kind of system that is lawful to deprive someone's liberty even for years just because of administrative status, even though that they haven't committed any crime. I mean, and we are living in democracies. There is sort of what we call rule of law. And those of us that are lawyers, we were taught that depriving someone's liberty is proportionally linked to maybe to a conduct that made some harm, no? That affected other people's rights, that, I don't know, murder or any other kind of contact that exceptionally may lead to depriving someone's liberty through a due process and so on. But now the reality that we see is that many people end up detained for months and years, even though this very basic requisite of the rule of law for depriving someone's liberty. So that is just one example of many other examples that are wrong. No? And so, of course, again, these guidelines are, on the one hand, directed to try to change that, and we have, as I said before, many good examples from different countries of the world that, again, that also have to cope with challenges related to many people trying to enter the country or to enter that have entered the country, but they don't go through that path, no, and putting them in this kind of prisons. But on the other hand, what I would say is that we need to approach other stakeholders, the non-usual suspects, because we always end up with this very narrow discussion with immigration enforcement authorities, because of the narratives are so narrow and so toxic that we cannot move ahead with the conversation. So that's why I think that with this guideline we'll try to do that, to promote other kind of conversation, no? And in that for doing that, talking with local government that are closer to the community, to the different, talking with or including the conversation local communities is I think it's one of the critical strategies for reshaping the discussion, and that hopefully in the short, in some aspect term, and others in the mid or long term, in the long term, we hopefully bring us to other kind of reality where, these diverse communities may have a better future no matter where each member has come from.
Did you want to add it?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. It's fine. Okay. Thank you. Merci. Thank you, Denise. Juste pour ajouter un point, je pense qu'il ne faut pas perdre de vue que nous parlons des droits humains.
I want to stress that we shouldn't forget that we're speaking about human rights.
Or, le principe fondamental des droits humains, c'est l'indivisibilité des droits humains.
And what's really important is the indivisibility of human rights.
Que vous soyez effectivement de groupes racialisés,
whether you're racialized,
ou que vous soyez des groupes de communautés indigènes,
whether you're from an indigenous community,
l'humain reste humain au central.
A human being stays human, and that's central.
Je pense qu'il y a d'abord un travail individuel à faire sur nous-mêmes.
I believe that first of all, there's an individual work, labor that we have to do on ourselves.
Puisque les recommandations générales, elles ne valent ce que les États peuvent en faire.
Because general recommendations are only worth what states can do about them.
Généralement, c'est le travail des citoyens qui est plus important.
Generally, it's the work of citizens which is the most important.
Or, nous sommes dans des sociétés dites démocratiques.
We are in so-called democratic societies.
C'est à ce niveau que se situe le défi fondamental.
And it's that level that we are challenged.
Voulons-nous des sociétés démocratiques et inclusives?
Do we wish for a democratic society which is inclusive?
C'est ça, ou voulons-nous des sociétés exclusives?
Or do we wish to be in societies that are exclusive?
C'est à ce niveau que se situe l'attention.
This is where we have to draw our attention.
C'est pourquoi il est extrêmement important
It's why it's really important
pour la recommandation générale que les acteurs de la société civile,
that actors from social society,
que le monde
civil
académique,
society, and that the world of academia,
qu'ils sachent effectivement que nous posons des principes d'égalité.
that we pose principles of equality.
Donc, il faudrait poser le problème en termes d'égalité.
We have to look at our challenges in terms of equality.
Effectivement, au niveau des Nations Unies, il y a tout un ensemble d'instruments qui existent.
In effect, we have a number of instruments within the international world,
Mais cela n'empêche pas que le monde est ce qu'il est.
but the world is as it is.
Donc, il faudrait toujours travailler donc, à construire des cohésions au sein de la société,
So we have to work.
à construire la cohésion.
We have to work with social cohesion,
Et c'est pourquoi, pour cette question précise,
and this is why for this specific question,
puisque c'est une question qui touche toutes les sociétés,
it's a question that all societies encounter.
ce serait très naïf de penser que la xénophobie, ça pose la question de noir et blanc.
It would be very naive to think that xenophobia is about black and white.
C'est très compliqué, c'est plus complexe que cela.
It's much more complicated, much more complex
C'est
than
pourquoi
that.
d'ailleurs la question de la définition fait problème.
This is why the question of a definition of xenophobia is problematic.
Prenons un exemple précis.
Let's take a precise example.
Si un Haïtien, par exemple, est refoulé de la République dominicaine,
For instance, if a Haitian person is deported from the Dominican Republic,
c'est un exemple précis, par exemple,
this is a precise example.
va-t-on parler de xénophobie, de racisme ou consort?
Will we speak about xenophobia, racism, or something else?
Donc, la xénophobie, elle agit à deux niveaux.
So xenophobia works at two different levels.
Par exemple, au niveau des frontières globales,
For instance, at the level of global borders,
mais aussi à l'intérieur de la société.
but also within societies themselves.
Donc, c'est une question d'abord de principe démocratique.
So it's first of all a question of democratic principles.
En tout cas, de toutes les observations aux recommandations générales qui ont été élaborées par les différents organes,
When we look at all the recommendations and all the observations that have been
ce qui est important,
oh, sorry, can you repeat please?
si l'on regarde la plupart des recommandations générales qui sont édictées par le comité,
If we look at most of the observations and general recommendations that the committee have put forward,
à chaque fois qu'un État est examiné,
every time that we are looking at specific state,
on renvoie l'État à ces recommandations générales. On renvoie l'État. On renvoie l'État. On renvoie l'État. On demande à l'État est-ce qu'il a rempli ses obligations par rapport à la recommandation générale.
we're looking at whether the state is fulfilling its obligations towards international conventions.
Et c'est ça qui fait vivre la recommandation générale. Et c'est ça qui fait vivre la recommandation générale. C'est ça qui fait vivre.
Vivre
Ouais.
quoi?
Une recommandation générale.
And this is what c'est ça qui fait vivre.
Qui donne sens, oui, qui donne sens.
This is what gives a sense or a meaning to international conventions.
Bon, pour celle-là, pour cette recommandation générale en cours, il s'agira effectivement, dès qu'elle sera adoptée,
So for the recommendations
dès qu'elle sera adoptée,
that are being developed,
de l'opposer donc aux États différents.
once they have been adopted, we have to make states face them.
En tout cas, je pense qu'on est tous d'accord là-dessus
I believe that we all agree
que nous sommes dans un monde de repli,
that we are in a world that is folding into itself,
que nous sommes dans un monde de nationalisme étroit.
that we are in a world that is based on narrow nationalism.
Or, nous savons historiquement
And we know, historically speaking,
où l'extrémisme a amené le monde.
where what extremism has led the world to become.
Où le repli sur soi a amené le monde. Où le repli sur soi. Repli sur soi.
Where when we,
Où le rejet de l'autre. Où le rejet de l'autre.
where if we reject the other,
Donc, c'est ça les enjeux principaux.
these are the main challenges that we meet,
En
rejecting
tout
others.
cas, dans la plupart des consultations que nous avons eues dans le monde,
At least in most nation states that we see in the world,
nous avons remarqué une chose.
we have noticed one thing.
Il y a une tension, un décalage.
There is a tension between.
En décalage.
Ça dépend.
En décalage. Oh, yes, en décalage. De rupture.
There's a rupture
Yes, yeah. entre le discours politique
between what's being said politically, political discourse,
et le discours des citoyens.
and what citizens are saying.
Donc ça qui est important.
This is really important to
Il
stress.
faut que le discours des citoyens,
Depends on, ça dépend ce qui vient après.
il faut que le discours des citoyens arrive effectivement à dépasser le discours des politiques.
We have to bring the discourse of citizens up to a political level.
Donc un travail d'éducation est important.
So
Un travail d'éducation.
Education is really important,
Un travail citoyen.
and the work of citizens is really important.
Thank you very much.
Once again, a perfect segue. So thank you both very much. And I also want to thank Carolina Sanchez-Boa, who stepped in to help us out. She's been here as an expert, works on incarceration, and lives in Paris. So, yeah, it was great to get to hear your take, Ibrahima. And it's interesting because when Pablo was talking, I thought, yeah, it just sounds so reasonable. What's the problem? And Ibrahima tells us a little bit more about the problem, and echoing somewhat, I think, what Congressman Casar was talking about too, like coming back to the idea that civil society isn't represented by the extremism. So we'll go with that, is also quite reasonable. But I want to come back to Becky and Claudia, since you both work with communities and from different perspectives and playing different roles. So we have these recommendations that are going to be out there that aren't just talking to states, or they need to be bolstered by those who are most affected. And so I wonder if you might each comment a bit about how you think this process might be useful for you in your work.
Absolutely. Okay, absolutely. I think something that's really important that I realized today, and thank you, Silky and Barbara, for helping me think through this, but I think just the internationalist perspective that it allows people here in the U.S. doing this work to have, and just kind of like the tools to do work around that. The shared framework, I think, of human rights, the right to mobility, to life, to self-determination, that I think is the basis of a lot of the organizing work that we do. And seeing that in language that goes beyond the U.S. was also something really important to me. And I think just naming that it is a pretty devastating time in pretty horrible conditions. So just having something positive where we can actually see ourselves and be seen and heard. It's really important, and just kind of the vision and I don't know, I think sometimes here in the U.S., you know, I was telling Barbara, like, we hear of the UN, and I know in other countries it's a you know, very respected body, and I know here too, but I know we also hear, you know, that sometimes the U.S. is the only country that doesn't join these committees or doesn't like endorse things, and it's horrible and it's pretty devastating for us. But I think being able to just have our voices, understanding the limitations, but also understanding that won't always be the case, that we won't always be able to get away with being part of these conversations and be accountable by them. For me as an organizer, and I think the communities that I work with and the people I work with, that's something really important, to just have those frameworks and those visions that go beyond our own limitations here.
I want to echo that absolutely, that the sort of visionary nature of human rights, always pushing us to think more expansively about human dignity, is amazing. And I'll tell you a quick story, which is that when I started at the University of Miami, I had as my neighbor a human rights lawyer, Carrie Bettinger-Lopez, and she showed me this amazing decision by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which was called Smith-Armendariz. And it basically held that our U.S. immigration statute that limits who can try to defend themselves against removal based on a crime you can't even apply if you have a certain kind of crime called an aggravated felony. That statute, that domestic statute, violated international law, human rights law. And I just looked at her and I was like, what is this? I want to be a human rights lawyer. And ever since that moment, it has really shaped my thinking about how we can argue things in court to try to reach that goal, right? How do we bring our domestic statutory and case law scheme to make it match those ideals in our human rights world? And so it's also sort of a thank you to the human rights advocates and lawyers, but it's also a reminder that we count on everyone to really push the envelope and move us in that direction, and to not just be reflective of where we've been or how we've historically thought about human dignity and protection, but to really be pushing us forward, because domestic law is so sluggish and difficult and fraught, especially now with the U.S. Supreme Court the way it is, that we need human rights norms and advocates and thinkers more than ever.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things I thought was just interesting and important about Pablo's last remarks, too, was that you all are working directly with people impacted by these immigration policies. But I heard part of it saying, like, maybe there are other places we can get human rights infused that would have an impact on those populations. And if you're thinking about the extent to which some local governments, for example, might take them up, then I think that's an important reminder, too, about coalition building and being in conversation with others. So we have a few questions from the audience. We have 4 more minutes. There's one that maybe we could answer it in a very, it could be an optimistic or a very pessimistic one. So maybe everyone can interpret it however you like. So Congressman Casar mentioned how we've seen a discursive backslide in recent years in terms of what civil discussion means. Vile, explicit xenophobic rhetoric is increasingly common, as you've all talked about in some way. So then the question is, how do you see the trend progressing, changing in coming years, and more specifically affecting legislation and border policies and practices?
30 seconds.
Yeah, and and where is because I think you already started to answer that, Claudia, with thinking about Texas and that legislative session happening. But I think there's also a call for, like, part of the idea of the recommendations is to change attitudes. It seems like we kept hearing, or to allow for the submerged, the attitudes we're not hearing enough, or the perspectives because of the overwhelming xenophobia.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say really quickly is that I think part of what's happened with the narrative that's coming out of the border is that a lot of times border communities themselves are not able to be participants in their own sort of narratives and discussions. And so I think a lot of the work for me, particularly as an organizer, and all of us who are organizing here, is to actually work with those communities and make sure that they are part of these conversations, that the discussions we're having here today, the narratives that we are coming up with, are reflected in their voices. Because we are about to start a legislative session, and those communities have to be part of the discussion. Otherwise, we end up with things like Abbott moving the border further north. And so I actually think it's pretty optimistic. Like, I talked a lot to people who are like, no, we're like screwed, to keep it very PG-13, but I actually think there is a lot of opportunity and beauty and creativity in how border communities actually see themselves and see immigration, and actually are doing a lot of work. I mean, we have Jennifer from Engle and Abuelas, who are like doing the daily work of actually working with migrants every day. So it's bad. The battle it's hard, but I actually think that there's a lot of people who are in these conversations and who are very creative, and I refuse to believe that we're not more creative than those who are trying to oppress us.
Should we end it on that good note, or does anybody else have an important final word? I will note that there is actually a little reception in the Sheffield room, so please join us for a minute for a quick refreshment, and we'll hang around there for a minute. So if there are questions or conversations that were not able to be had, maybe we can do those quickly in the Sheffield room, just right down the hall. Thank you all very, very, very much for participating today. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.